future, if you can't find anybody else to give talks, I'm always eager because it allows me to sort of deepen my understanding of this extraordinary expedition. I hope you all got your copies of We Proceeded On, the Stephen Ambrose issue. The question is, how long am I going to? I was at WSU Press in Pullman the other day, and they said, "How long are you going to continue to do this?" And I said, "Until I get one out on the first day of the month." So I'm patience, everybody. I'm working on trying to speeding up the turnaround. We got a lot of steps in this, and there are supply side shortages, blah blah blah. I love doing this, and I'm really thrilled. And if you aren't now a member of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, it's the simplest thing in the world, and then you get these 4 issues of WPO. So the background to this talk is that I'm fascinated by this. So, I've come into a consulting relationship with Washington State University Press. They design We Proceeded On. It's printed somewhere else now. And they have a press. I just toured it the other day. It's an in-house press. They don't ship their books out to be imprinted somewhere else. And they're wanting to expand. And they're particularly interested in titles involving Lewis and Clark. And they've asked me to help recruit. So if you have an idea about a book on Lewis and Clark, any aspect, especially Native American relations, but any aspect, or if you know people who do, or know people who you might want to encourage, I'd be very happy to hear all of that. But they would like to become the Lewis and Clark press of record, which I think would be a very wonderful thing for us. We, as you all know, we represent a sort of, how shall I put it, a senior citizen population demographic, and we really need to encourage young Lewis and Clark scholars and scholars who are looking at the Europeanization of the American West in all sorts of ways. So that said, this is one of those areas where I think a book is needed. Winter on the Lewis and Clark Trail. What happens is that the authors like Stephen Ambrose and others kind of jump from travel period to travel period, and then the winter camps, especially the first one at Camp Wood, get pretty short shrift. And at the other end, Fort Clatsop gets pretty short shrift because by then the author has already written 380 pages and needs to get them home just as quickly as possible. And so winter is a very important thing. I'll try to tell you why here. I'm going to go to my PowerPoint. I've got about 40 slides. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but I want to show you a few that are really important, I think. First of all, happy holidays, everybody. I'm really glad to have this opportunity. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And if you have a burning question, just do your raise your hand thing or get Aaron's attention and he'll interrupt me. But I'll try to go for about 35 minutes here, and then we'll do Q&A. But anyway, happy holidays to all of you. So Lewis and Clark, that's Clark on the left. For those who might not know, one of the things that I've tried to do with my career as a Lewis and Clark lover and scholar is to detach them a little bit. So, you can look at them this way, the sort of the identical twins of the highway sign. I think it's actually more fruitful to separate them just a little and to realize that they were extraordinary friends, incredible partners. They're deeply complementary in the ways that they each made the other better. It's hard to imagine the expedition without both of them at the lead. In fact, it's hard to imagine the expedition without Clark at the lead. And in some very limited respects, I think it should be called the Clark and Lewis expedition. That would offend Mr. Jefferson, who always called it the Lewis expedition. But if you're talking about how you're going to get from St. Louis to the ocean and back again, you probably want to be talking more with Clark than with Lewis. And so I don't want to make too much of the separation between them, but I think the more we look at them as separate human beings, wired differently, with different ways of seeing and different leadership skills, different basic styles, I think the more interesting this story gets. You don't want to push this too far, but I think it's that severing them a little is a very important historiological insight. All right, so Lewis and Clark at Camp Wood, the mustering. They were there from December. These are somewhat arbitrary dates. I've taken them from Gary Moulton's most recent book, Lewis and Clark Day by Day, which, by the way, is a terrific book. Really, in some ways, the best one-volume book we have. He's done a masterful job of telling you the highlights for each day, and then sort of pulling back a little bit from time to time and saying, well, Lewis's journal seems to be copying Clark here, or Clark stops writing here. He talks about the geology of the trail, where the campsites are today. It's really a marvelous piece of work. So I'm using his dates, December 12th, 1803 to May 14th, 1804. That's the Camp Wood interlude, 159 days. Then Lewis and Clark at Fort Mandan. I'm sort of calling that snug on the northern plains. They're really bedding down for the winter. And I'm a North Dakotan and a very proud one. But North Dakota is not for the faint of heart. It's an acquired taste. And that winter must have been a real eye-opener to everyone on the expedition. These Virginians cannot have anticipated what this was going to be like. And one of the things I found in looking at the third camp, Fort Clatsop, is that several times in the course of the winter, the two captains say, man, the weather's good here compared to that thing we had at Fort Mandan. And so they really hunkered down to a very considerable degree. And one of my favorite single journal entries for the North Dakota phase is when Ordway, who's really a marvelous journal keeper, says it's so cold that they had the fires burning as much wood as they could pile on them in the chimneys, in the fireplaces, all day and all night, and yet there was frost on the inside of the stones at the back of the fireplace, so that the cold was so great that even with these fires burning 24 hours a day, there was frost accumulating on the inside of the back of the stone fireplace. That's cold. And I've actually camped at Fort Mandan twice in the winter. Once it was 17 below. And you just wonder, why any rational person would do that. They were there from November 3rd, these are Gary's dates again, November 3rd, 1804 to April 7th, 1805, a total of 155 days. Then they were at Fort Clatsop. I'm calling that, via Shakespeare, the winter of our discontent. They were there from December 7th, 1805 to March 23rd, 1806, a total of 106 days. And so if you add all that up, they were in camp, that is not proceeding on, for 1,000, well, the total expedition is 1,016 days by this count, from if you start at December 12th, 1803 and end at September 23rd, 1806, that's 1,016 days, and 420 of them, just under half, 41%, were spent in winter camps. I think that's a really startling and very interesting statistic. So here's this very crude map of the trail, and here are the three forts. Camp Wood here on the Illinois side, on the Illinois side of the Missouri River, Fort Mandan on the east bank, the north bank of the Missouri at the Great Bend near today's Stanton or Washburn. And then, of course, Fort Clatsop, just a few miles in from the coast near Astoria. But look at it from kind of a second point of view, and that is from a we proceeded on point of view. What are the choke points? Well, there are three of them particularly. One, the first choke point is Camp Wood. As you all know, Lewis and Clark wanted to go several hundred miles up the Missouri in 1803 before winter closed the road, and sort of as a shakedown cruise to try to work things out, know if they've missed anything that they had to send somebody back for, to get underway, to shorten the length of the time of the entire expedition. But they were blocked, and they wound up having to stay on the Illinois side, just across from the mouth of the Great Missouri River. And there's several very interesting journals by Clark where he's watching the ice flows and the trees and detritus coming down the Missouri. And he's just, you can get a little sense of dread, like we're going to have to go against that thing, that river. all the way up to its source. The second choke point is in the middle of North Dakota, where they built Fort Mandan. And that's because the road closed, and I'll come back to that. But they would have gone farther. They actually thought they would get to the Rock Mountains on the first great year of travel. Instead, they got 1,610 miles, and they stopped because the road closed. I'll show that in a moment. And then the third checkpoint was not at Fort Clatsop. In some ways, it's surprising that they stopped. You know, it's in a sense, it's like in an Olympic swimming pool. You might have expected them to get to the coast. Hang on, sorry. Might have expected them to get to the coast, sort of spend a few weeks and turn back and go at least to the Nez Perce lands or beyond the rain shadow of the Cascades, but they didn't. And of course, the reason almost certainly that they didn't is that they hoped for a trade vessel and resupply. So they really weren't choked at the coast. But when they came back beginning March 23rd of 1806 and tried to push their way too soon through the Rockies, through the Bitterroots, they were warned by everybody that they were going to hit a wall of snow. But Lewis, in his impetuosity, wanting desperately to get home in the 1806 travel season, which one can understand, pushed too fast, too hard, and they hit a wall of snow, just as the natives had told them, and they had to stop. They built scaffolds, and they spent, the better part of 2 months waiting to get through the Bitterroots. And then once they did, they had to sort of rush their way down. They made it September 23rd. Amazing. The return journey, incredibly efficient. So let me go back here to this. Choke point number one was Spanish diplomatic intransigence, which really was unnecessary, but it was what it was. Choke point number two was the river froze over. There was no road to travel in. And choke point number three, if you put that at Fort Clatsop, was rest for the crew and hoping for a trade ship to resupply or send journals and other things back around the tip of South America, including maybe a member or two of the expedition back to the Chesapeake. This is what the interstate highways look like now. Road closed, you can't go. They were on a river journey, and rivers then were roads, and roads were rivers. And here's what happened. I mean, the dates are really astonishing if you look at this day by day. They started their winter the building of Fort Mandan on November 3rd. The river was already icing up. Ice was forming around the oars. If a bucket of water left out overnight would have a few centimeters of ice on it. So the river was freezing, but it was still technically navigable. But they stopped on November 3rd, and just 12 days later, the river froze, and there would be no further progress until the river opened. So they went as long as they could, and they fortuitously stopped at the best possible place. They were expecting to get to the Rock Mountains. They stopped at a village at 5 villages, 3 Hidatsa, 2 Mandan, of about 4,500 individuals. And the Mandan, particularly, the Hidatsa a little less so, proved to be outstanding hospitality providers. And then I'm sorry, something's going wrong with my cursor here, but at the other end, the river opened, the river stopped being flooded, stopped being ice covered.
The tangerine wheat.
I'm sorry. Please mute if you're not talking. The Missouri opened again. The ice broke up on April 2nd, and they were gone 5 days later. They left on April 7th. So if you just look at it from that point of view, they stopped when the interstate highway closed. It happened to be the Missouri River, and they started the minute it reopened, just as we would all do. And here is I'm just sorry about these blue squiggles. I'm not sure what to do about them. We'll let it go. This is of course, a great painting of people crossing the Missouri after the ice had become firm enough for that. And there's another sort of interstate road closed sign. So hang on here. So things to read. First of all, Gary Moulton's book, as I've said, Lewis and Clark Expedition Day by Day, is outstanding. And what I did to prepare for this talk is go to all 3 of those periods you see on the right I just put January 1st, January 2nd, January 3rd, and put one line to Max for every day. Sort of, he summarizes the expedition in a few short paragraphs per day. I then summarized Moulton in one or two sentences, and it actually turns out to be extremely revealing. I recommend it as a technique for anyone who's thinking about lecturing about or writing about the expedition. And I'll come back to show a couple of ways in which that really helped. And here's just one of them. If you can't hardly read my handwriting, but if you look at January 11th there, unsuccessful search for a missing canoe. Meriwether Lewis regards it as a serious loss. They later found the canoe, but that's the sort of thing that I will include here. A little bit above, and seasonal arrival of trade vessels, and Clark shudders when he considers the route that he has to take back from the salt camp to Fort Clatsop. Two more books that I highly recommend, especially, of course, the one on the left river, Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia. Nicandry's book is, in my view, the best book that we have on the Columbia side of the expedition. He really did some pioneering work in that. There's more to be done. And my book, The Character of Meriwether Lewis, I only recommend for this reason. It has a chapter on winter at Fort Mandan, and also a chapter on the holidays, so birthdays, New Year's, and Christmas, and so and the 4th of July. And so it includes some of the details that are really interesting and don't wind up in an Ambrose or a Lavender because they're too minor for that kind of a romp. And then on the left is my edition of Lewis and Clark in North Dakota, day by day by day. Each journal keeper on the day that he wrote. So everybody's on for February 4th, including the weather. Everybody's who's writing is on February 5th, including the weather. If they wrote a letter, it's printed on the day that it was written. And then Rex Seek's book, which you probably all know, beautifully illustrated, his in full view about Lewis and Clark in the Lower Columbia. Then Robert Hartley's book, Lewis and Clark in the Illinois Country, The Little Told Story, the best thing we have on Camp Wood. And then Robert Moore's extraordinary book with the help of Michael Haynes as illustrator, Tailor Made and Trail Worn. All right, so the Camp Wood interlude, what does the Camp Wood interlude tell us? It's characterized by proximity to the frontier, to Cahokia and to St. Louis. Those are really important factors here. They weren't far enough away from St. Louis and Cahokia to really be underway. And this caused some problems because if you think about these winters, I sort of made a Maslowian list here as I was waiting for us to begin. What happens in the winter? Well, the first winter is a little bit different because they're still preparing. For example, at Camp Wood, they did serious modifications to the barge, to the keelboat, major modifications. They were still gathering food. They filled 45 kegs of pork, which is not a simple matter to preserve it in a way that will allow it to be edible 6 months or 2 years from now. They were still gathering basic provisions for the expedition. As you know, Lewis had more or less unilaterally tripled the size. Congress had intended 10 to 12 men. After consultation in St. Louis and after consultation with Jefferson, Lewis decided that he needed a lot more personnel. And so he had done his provisioning back in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Harper's Ferry for about 15, and he had to piece that out locally. So that was a lot of what they were doing. But here are the basic needs of a winter encampment, particularly at Fort Mandan and Fort Clatsop. Food. No problems food at Camp Wood. There were lots of local farmers and purveyors who were willing to provide food. The game was plentiful. There were fish to be had. Food was abundant, and there's no sense in the journal that Clark keeps that food was a matter of urgency. They could have all the food they wanted. Shelter. In each case, the expedition built a compound. One of the things that strikes me as so interesting, and maybe one of you has thoughts about this, But we usually say that Patrick Gass, the carpenter, was responsible for the designs and and supervising the construction. I don't see any reason to doubt that. But does strike me that we have three quite different forts. Fort Mandan is the most formidable of the three, with a strong palisade. In fact, one of the Canadians who was visiting the Mandan villages said, and I'm quoting, it's almost cannonball proof. I mean, they must have been really concerned about the Lakota, the Sioux, but they built a very strong compound in North Dakota. Fort Clatsop would be second, I think, in its capacity as a fortress. I think the sense they had at Fort Clatsop was that the natives might be pilfering, they might sneak things away, might steal, but that I don't think they felt that there would be any organized attack on the expedition. Although I'll come back to that strange thing that Lewis said on February 20th, 1806. And then at Camp Wood, I'm going to exaggerate pretty considerably here, but it feels a little bit more like a Motel 6. I don't think they had any particular concerns about basic security. And so the fact that these are three different designs, I think, is really remarkable. And I would like somebody to write an article about what we know about this. Was there a standard cookie cutter design for a frontier fort? What was Patrick Gass up to? What role did the captains play? What role did the availability of materials play, or the terrain? For example, at Fort Mandan, right behind it was a cliff, and they built it there so that they could not be attacked very easily from behind. So I think much more on the basic layout of the forts would be really interesting. So here's, again, I apologize for the squiggles, but if I tried to get rid of them at this point, it would slow us down for half an hour. Here's the mouth of the Missouri coming in to the Mississippi. Here, this is a little pixelated, but here's a recreation, of course, of Camp Wood. Here's a better picture of it. I think of this, if you've ever seen the great film The Dirty Dozen, this is how I see this period. If you read Clark's journal, Lewis is silent, of course. Nobody else is yet writing. So Clark is our single source, except for letters, for this period. And the sense you get is that he's there and whipping these raw recruits into something like a corps of discovery. There were 6 courts-martial in the course of the expedition. 2 of them occurred at Camp Wood, and that wasn't all of the infractions. Clark handled much of it in a much more informal way. For example, when several men were fist fighting, and apparently pretty seriously, he didn't do anything more than assign them to go help the washerwoman build a hut, a cabin nearby Camp Wood. Clark he was more flexible, more tolerant, I think more generous than Lewis. But his job, and Lewis, I'll come back to that in a minute, Lewis was not there for most of that time. His job was to take these raw recruits, many of whom really were not ready for an expedition of military discipline, and turn them into a corps. And so one of the things they did was target practice. This is Christmas, by the way. Here's target practice. This is Michael Haynes on that. They had target shooting matches with the local frontiersmen. And if you follow the journal through the spring, at first the locals are winning. Clark, sort of like Ahab, puts up a silver dollar or a silver 10, and whoever is the best team gets that reward. For the first few weeks, the locals are winning, but as we get towards May, Lewis and Clark's men are starting to win the target practice. Well, this is, of course, not just recreation, although it is that. At this point, they don't know 2 things: how much they're going to have to eat at the end of a rifle, but they're presuming quite a bit. And they don't know how much hostility they're likely to encounter. So they need men who can really handle these firearms. And so that was one of their purposes. Here's Christmas. And this is a little bit pixelated, but you can see that some of the men are frolicking. Some are looking on. Native Americans came. They gave some of the Native Americans bottles of whiskey. And here's what Clark says. I'm going to quote a couple of passages from each of these three phases. I was awakened by a Christmas discharge, found that some of the party had got drunk. The men frolicked and hunted all day. Snow this morning, ice run all day, several turkey killed. Shields returned from across the river, by the way, with a cheese and 4 pounds of butter. So they spiced up the Christmas meal a little by sending Shields off for cheese and butter to supplement the pretty raw diet that otherwise would have been used there. But turkeys, and of course, there's always venison at Camp Wood. And when he says several of the party got drunk, that's probably not the expedition's official supply. One of the problems of being so close to Cahokia and St. Louis was that there were locals all too willing to either set up stills nearby or to bring whiskey for the men. And Clark worked hard to prevent that, but he was unable to do it entirely. Then 3 Indians come today to take Christmas with us. I gave them a bottle of whiskey and they went off after informing me that a great talk had been held and that all the nations were going to war against the Ozarks in 3 months. One informed me that an Englishman 16 miles from here told him that the Americans had the country and no one was allowed to trade, etc. I explained the intention of government to him and the cause of the possession. So one thing is food, another is shelter. Have that. The clothing is still plentiful. Discipline. There were discipline problems, but Clark handled them extremely well. Lewis, not so well. I'll come back to that. Recreation, including the shooting matches. Preparedness and fitness. You know, one of the things that I find so interesting about May 14th is that the men, some of them were professional watermen, but most of them were not. And those first 10 or 15 days against the river at its widest must have been grueling and exceedingly tiring. If you've ever been on a long canoe trip, you know, those first couple of days really get to you unless you plan very short passage. And against that mighty river and with all 60,000 pounds worth of stuff, you know, it's like watching a Saturn V rocket lift off at Cape Kennedy, that it just barely has enough thrust. It must have been really hard. And they hadn't particularly been training. Today, they would be trained like Navy SEALs to get ready for this. That wasn't the case there. So that must have been hard. And then in the second 2 winters at Fort Mandan and Fort Clatsop, one of the concerns had to be to give the men enough rest, which they desperately needed, but not to let them be idle, not only because idleness creates mischief, but also because they didn't want their muscle tone to deteriorate so much that it would be more difficult for them to get started when they needed to. So there's a delicate balance that the captains had to maintain after the first year. Preparedness, sexual opportunity. You know, whenever they stopped for more than a day or two, the men got as much sexual access as they could. This would be particularly the case at Fort Mandan and at Fort Clatsop. At Fort Mandan, from the men's point of view, this was kind of a golden period because there was a lot of available sex and the captains were not very uptight about it. And they sort of looked on venereal disease, STDs, as the cost of doing business and had a way to treat them. When they got to Fort Clatsop, it was a little bit different, and Lewis fretted. For one thing, the native women along the coast showed more signs of STDs than did the Mandan and Hidatsa. But also Lewis had been through this, had been through the treatment of STDs, which is, and John Fisher can tell you, is no fun for anybody. And he worried that the men might be debilitated in some ways, not 100% for the return journey. And so he gave a temperance lecture and, you know, tried to suggest self-restraint. Well, that's probably not going to work. I don't want to go into any more detail about this, except to say just a couple of quick things. First of all, these were 24-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 25-year-olds. There's a lot of testosterone here. And what we know from sexual dynamics is that people find a way. So when there were available native women, of course, there were probably women available at or near Camp Wood. we know that the washerwoman was there. I asked Gary Moulton if she could have been, if there's a euphemism here, that she could have been performing any other services for the expedition, and he said he didn't think so. But there are camp followers in any military expedition. It would be surprising if there wasn't some sort of sexual access at Camp Wood. And of course, we know that when there are not people of the desired sex available, that people will pair off, as in prisons. The less said maybe about that, the better, but it is an important part of the dynamics. But I just want to say this about Native American women and sexual access. From the expedition's point of view, from the enlisted man's point of view, this was a wonderful thing, because they, for a trinket, for a fish hook, for a small piece of ribbon, for a tiny pocket mirror or a grass curtain ring, they could have sexual access. And many, perhaps not all of the men, took great satisfaction from that. But from a Native point of view, it's really important that we see it differently. This wasn't just a world of loose women. The natives wanted to find out more about the expedition. They thought that by getting women close to members of the expedition, they not only could get stuff, a hatchet, a knife, whatever it might be, but they also could learn things. And the Mandan in particular, as you know, if you've read the accounts, believe that there's carnal knowledge, and in their buffalo medicine dance, which the members of the expedition attended, the Mandan wanted to incorporate, literally to incorporate DNA from the expedition into their own tribal DNA, partly to keep up a variety in the gene pool, but also because they felt that some of the medicine, some of the whatever the mojo was of these white men with all these gadgets and all this power, might be able to be incorporated by way of sexual intercourse. So I think we need to see it in a much more nuanced and subtle and less sort of frat boy way when we talk about this. But I move on. Some wanted spiritual satisfaction. We get very little notice in the journals of spiritual satisfaction. Jefferson was a deist. Lewis was a deist. As far as we know, they did not carry a Bible, not officially at least, but men might have been carrying a Bible. We don't know. I'm almost certain there was prayer. We don't know much about this. This is not the kind of thing that gets written up in an Enlightenment report for a deistic and skeptical president. But, if you know much about humans in difficult situations, I believe there were probably prayer groups. There certainly were hymns sung. And we just so wish we knew much, 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 much more about that. Then there's intoxication. We've talked a little bit about that. There were rations that were essentially mandated under Army protocols, but when the men had a chance to drink more than that, they often did. So just one more thing about sex. The captains abstained, at least they told us they did, but we know that Clark, during the interlude with the Nez Perce on the return, almost certainly fathered a Nez Perce person by the name of Daytime Smoke, and we know that because of the red hair. So here they are in their shooting match. Here's Ordway. This is one of my favorite of all Michael Haynes illustrations, paintings. There's the keelboat, the barge, and Ordway is dutifully keeping his journal under a full moon. And then, but you have some of the men who don't have that responsibility frolicking to probably Cruzat's fiddle. This is just a really marvelous illustration of an evening, a full moon evening on the Lewis and Clark Trail. So here's Lewis. You're going to see him fade out. And here's why. At Camp Wood, Lewis was there only 36 days. And more importantly than that, Lewis was not there from December 12th until January 27th. So for that extremely important formative period where the men are getting used to each other, they're developing a pecking order, they're fighting, they're seeing who's the jokester, who's the lazy one, who's the drunk, who's the who's the sarcast, who's cynical, who mouths off, who shirks duty, who belches, and who sings well or sings not at all. As all this is happening, as the sort of the dirty dozen dynamics are coming together, it's Clark. It's Clark who's shaping this and observing it, not Lewis. Lewis is off in Cahokia. Lewis is off in St. Louis, and he was doing important things, diplomatic things. He was looking at maps. He was talking to the Choteaus and to other traders and to individuals like Mackay, who had been up the river. He was doing important information gathering. But one also gets the sense, and I hope I'm not being too hard on Lewis here, you get the sense that he sort of liked being in Cahokia and St. Louis rather than in a crude fort out at the mouth of the Missouri, and that he absented himself more than probably one would have hoped. And I think this had a very important influence on everything that happened thereafter. I think the men essentially looked to Clark as their primary commander. They respected, maybe admired, certainly admired Lewis. But I think that he was more detached, I think probably on purpose, and that they then naturally looked to the other captain who had been there from the beginning. And if you read all of the journals from May 14th through May 21st, it really does appear, if you only had that it was Clark's expedition. And I just want to pause there to read one passage from my book, if I can find it. It's where Lewis comes back and he discovers that there has been a lot of anarchy in his absence, and that several people have threatened poor Ordway. Hang on. Wow, that really skipped ahead. I'm so sorry. Several people have threatened poor Ordway, and there's been drunkenness, and people have refused to engage in guard duty, and so on. And here's what he says. He writes this very strange instruction, this detachment order on March 3rd. I'm just going to quote a couple of passages. The commanding officer feels himself mortified and disappointed at the disorderly conduct of Reuben Fields in refusing to mount guard when in due routine of duty he was regularly warned. Nor is he less surprised at the want of discretion in those who urged his opposition to the faithful discharge of his duty, particularly Shields, whose sense of propriety he had every reason to believe would have induced him rather to have promoted good order. That's pretty highfalutin prose. Mortified and propriety. I mean, this is Lewis. You can't imagine Clark writing those sentences. This is so Lewis. It's early Lewis, to be sure, but it's so different from Clark's disciplinary and leadership style. And here's the part I love even more. Here's one more bit. He's saying, I suppose a lot of you think that if we really want to discipline, then either Clark or I should have been in camp, but we had to be both in St. Louis. And so I hope that didn't allow you to think you could do anything. And he says, a moment's reflection must convince every man of our party that were we to neglect the more important and necessary arrangements in relation to the voyage we are now entering in, for the purpose merely of remaining at camp in order to communicate our orders in person to the individuals of the party on mere points of policy, they would have too much reason to complain, nay, even to fear the ultimate success of the enterprise in which we are embarked. Nay? I mean, come on, these are rough frontiersmen. These are the 9 young men from Kentucky, and Lewis is talking as if he's in diplomatic circles in Paris. He just didn't get it, at least not yet. And Clark, as we know, would never have written any of that. Clark handled the fist fight between the men, not by court-martialing them. He sent them to build a hut for the washerwoman. And we'll see when we get to Fort Mandan. I'm going to hasten forward here because we're running out of time. Just want to quickly then go through the rest of this. Fort Mandan, they had the great good fortune to winter amongst 4,500 people and British operatives. And those British operatives, especially 2 of them, Antoine Larocque and Charles Mackenzie, are extraordinarily important voices that tell us a lot about Lewis and Clark that we wouldn't know from their own diaries. Here's Catlin's villages, and this is how the Mandan earth lodges look in the winter today. It doesn't snow a lot in North Dakota. Here's a beautiful sunset picture. This is at Stanton, North Dakota. Here's a stylized view of what the fort would have looked like. Makes the hills much bigger than they were. Here's an aerial photo on the left of Fort Mandan, which is, by the way, 14 miles from where it should be, but they built it to be close to the city of Washburn. And then on the right, Michael Haynes' excellent illustration painting of the Aurora Borealis. This is Charles Russell's famous painting of Le Borgne. That's Le Borgne. I won't point with my cursor lest I make things worse, but that's Le Borgne on the left there, rubbing off what he took to be York's war paint or pigmentation. This is inside an earth lodge. This actually occurred, although perhaps not quite in this way. And you see some of the other expedition members sitting around the corner there. And this is a Mandan buffalo medicine dance, as Catlin saw it. That's not the one that Lewis and Clark's men participated in, which was where the carnal knowledge was being transferred from the wife of the hunter to an expeditionary member, and then she would then represent that carnal knowledge to her husband, and he theoretically would have more potency in every possible way because of that. Very sacred ceremony, and Lewis and Clark sent men to it, and York was a favorite. And of course, Lewis and Clark's men saw it in a purely opportunistic way, but the Mandan were seeing it in a sacred way. Then at Fort Clatsop, and just to wrap up Fort Mandan in about 5 sentences. So food was abundant, but they had to go in search of it at times, because one of the downsides of a sedentary set of villages is that you hunt out the local game. And so the Mandan and the Hidatsa would pray for the buffalo to come into their zip code. But if they didn't, they had to resort to their very extensive granaries. They were master farmers, especially corn. They had 13 varieties of corn, and also sunflowers and squashes and beans and so on. They had these huge underground cache pits, grain pits, and they were therefore really important in the nutritional trade of the upper Great Plains. But they wanted protein of the sort that buffalo provided, and so they went on hunts with Lewis and Clark. At one point, Clark leaves for 8 days with a group of the expedition's men to go as far as it's going to take to get a supply of meat. And they wind up in a huge, terrible blizzard situation, going down as far as Bismarck, 45 full miles from Fort Mandan, to get a supply of meat, which they pull back on sleds. And during that period, by the way, that 8-day period, Clark, for the only time in the course of the expedition, did not keep a journal. Why? Because he's in a blizzard, far away from ink. But when he got back, he summarized those 8 days, day by day, on the 9th. So his fidelity and reliability as a journal keeper is just extraordinary. The other thing that Lewis and Clark wanted at Fort Mandan was information from native peoples about the road ahead. They didn't know much about it. They thought they were walking off the map of the known world when they left on April 7th. And so they were asking the Hidatsa particularly, who were greater wanderers, and the Mandan and the British traders, what they might expect. And Sheheke, the big white of the Mandan, and others drew maps for them, either charcoal on animal skins or using mud and sticks and so on, and wound up giving Lewis and Clark a very thorough understanding of the terrain through Montana, which really helped them. And so they were gathering information. And as you know, they were also preparing reports. Lewis and Clark wrote the Mandan Miscellany, which is a book-length report on what they had seen and observed so far and collected. Lewis wrote letters to his mother and to Jefferson, and other members wrote letters to their kin. They sent back live specimens, including the live prairie dog and the 4 magpies and the sage grouse. This was a very busy time, but the thing they wanted most was for the men to rest after a grueling first year of travel, and the men did, and it was a very successful time. There were a couple of incidents that I don't have time to really go into, but the Lakota actually roughed up some hunters from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and this led to a reprisal party that that never made contact with the Lakota. They also roughed up some Mandans, and Lewis and Clark tried to come to their aid and sort of freak the Mandan leadership out by the sort of overreaction to what the Mandan regarded as yet another skirmish. And then just Christmas for a moment. This is my favorite of all of the Christmases, but and the reason I love this Christmas so much is that the captains, and probably Clark, but they realized that the men must be homesick. Nobody doesn't think about home on Christmas. And so they had saved a few things. They had some pepper, and they had some dried apples, and they had some special brandy called tafia, and a few other articles that that you couldn't get from the land, and you couldn't trade with natives. They had brought these little bits of civilization all the way from St. Louis, and they distributed them to the messes on this day because they wanted to domesticate, to bring a little domesticity to Christmas Day. And then they told the Mandan that it was our big medicine day, that the Mandan should stay away because this is our big medicine day. And Clark came out early, provided whiskey, came out again, more whiskey. There were shooting of guns and so on. And then at about 2 p.m., they cleared out one of the huts, one of the dormitories, and they danced until in the evening. And we know that 3 Indian women, probably Sacagawea, Otter Woman, and Yellowcorn, were there. They did not dance, but they observed these white men frolicking on this medicine day. It's all really interesting. So that I think is really a sign of the remarkable leadership of the 2 captains, and particularly, I suppose, Clark. But the other thing about that Christmas is that Lewis makes no appearance. He's not writing, of course, but the others are, and nobody mentions him. They say Clark came out and gave us some whiskey, and then later Clark came back and gave us this brandy, and then they say Clark did this and Clark did that. No single person mentions Lewis whatsoever, and we don't want to presume too much from that. But it appears that Lewis may have stayed the whole day in his hut, in his office. Now, he's like Jefferson, he's a deist, so he doesn't believe that Christmas is a real thing, at least from a Christian point of view. But it's a remarkable absence, and it really makes one wonder, A, what he's doing, and B, what it signifies. So quickly, I want to wrap up my talk here in 9 minutes so that we can have some Q&A. The Clatsop winter, the winter of our discontent. First of all, you all know Dismal Niche and how horrible it was, how they were within a few miles of the coast and they couldn't get there. And that's when Clark said, someone looking from above would just commiserate and show sympathy for our terrible situation. The great trees, trunks were rolling in, the waves were swamping. They couldn't even find a flat place to lie down. Everything was soggy and wet. They were miserable. They didn't know if it would ever end. This was probably the most miserable single week of the entire expedition, and to be that close. And so we have a range of different illustrations of how horrible, as Clark put it, that time was. Just huddled down, trying to stay as dry as you can under conditions in which you cannot be dry, and just waiting for the weather to clear. And meanwhile, the Clatsop and Chinook Indians are coming in their canoes, nonchalantly bracing against those waves. And Lewis and Clark said they couldn't believe that anybody could navigate in the canoe in the broad 11-mile estuary, 5 to 11-mile estuary of the Columbia, but the natives were able to do it. And here's Fort Clatsop in the winter. You don't see snow there very often. Here's another. You see it doesn't have the same impregnability as Fort Mandan, but here's why they were there. I think, they had the so-called vote, but I think it was really a plebiscite more than a vote. The captains were free to make the decision, but I think they desperately wanted a ship, a trade ship, and that's why they wintered there, even though they would have been a lot happier from several points of view had they gone up towards the Dalles, beyond the rain shadow, or maybe all the way back to the Nez Perce, which would have been possible. The Columbia wouldn't have frozen. But they chose instead to stay there. Lewis had that universal letter of credit. I think he desperately wanted to use it. And what would they have bought? I think that's one of the most intriguing what ifs. Well, we know some of it. They would have bought trade goods, beads, especially blue beads. They would have bought needles, awls, hatchets, mirrors, bolts of cloth, ribbon, all the things that they were using to buy services and goods from the native peoples. There's this great passage that Lewis has during this period in which he says, I looked at the merchandise. Now everything we have would fit in 2 handkerchiefs. It's all rusted out. There's almost nothing there. And he says, thank goodness for our gunpowder, because our gunpowder alone is going to allow us to travel 4,000 miles back to civilization. That, we're really on our own. We're destitute. We have nothing to trade. We're going to have to eat off the land. And if we are able to trade for anything, it will be really remarkable. And as you all know, what happened was that they began doing doctor services, which they felt a little guilty about. But that was one way that they could obtain some of what they needed on the return journey. And there was the salt factory. They wound up making several bushels of salt. But basically, they were there in the hopes of this. And if they had reached a trade ship and it seemed friendly, they would have bought clothing and boots, of course. I don't think they would have gotten more ammunition or lead. Would Lewis have sent back materials by sea? Depends, I think, on whether he trusted the captain of the ship and the nationality. Would Lewis have sent back men? Maybe himself? Unknown. I don't think so. Remember, every time he had a chance to send back men from Fort Mandan and then from the Great Falls, which he had sort of said he would, he changed his mind and said, if I did it, I might be undermanned, but more importantly, the other members of the expedition might look on this with resentment. And then he uses his famous phrase, it might have defeated the expedition altogether. So it's not clear what he would have done, but we know that he was looking for that boat. Here's an image of the salt works. And then I'm going to close with these 2 passages, and then I'm sorry to rush a little, but then we can talk more about it. I love this one. This is one of my favorite Lewis passages of all. This is January 1st. And by the way, on January 1st, he lights up as a journal keeper after a long and really unconscionable and irresponsible silence. Lewis comes back to life, and he writes continuously from January 1st, 1806 until August 12th, the day after he was shot in the buttocks in northwestern North Dakota, when he put down his pen once and for all. But it seems like it was a New Year's resolution. And I just went through that material this week to get ready. His natural history essays during that period from January 1st until about March 21st are some of the most important work that he ever did. Unfortunately, it came to nothing, because since he died, and since Nicholas Biddle omitted the scientific data from his paraphrase adventure story of Lewis and Clark, all that marvelous, painstaking, thoughtful observation by Lewis wasn't lost, but it was essentially lost. And others then had to describe all those creatures, all those trees, all those plants. And Lewis, because of this, lost his rightful place as one of the supreme natural history authors and scientists, amateur scientists in American history. It just breaks my heart to think that all that really important work essentially found no readers. But here's what he wrote on January 1st. This morning I was awoke at an early hour by the discharge of a volley of small arms, which were fired by our party in front of our quarters to usher in the new year. So far, so good. This was the only mark of respect which we had it in our power to pay this celebrated day. Our repast of this day, though better than that of Christmas, consisted principally in the anticipation of the first day of January 1807, next year, when in the bosom of our friends we hope to participate in the mirth and hilarity of the day, and when the zest given by the recollection of the present we shall completely, both mentally and corporally, enjoy the repast which the hand of civilization has prepared for us. At present we were content with eating our boiled elk and wapato, and solacing our thirst with our only beverage, pure water. Two of our hunters who set out this morning returned in the evening, having killed 2 buck elk. They presented Captain Clark and myself each a marrow bone and a tongue, on which we supped. That's just beautiful. Homesick. Where's he going to be on January 1870? He's going to be in the White House with Jefferson, with his patron. And he was, by the way. And you can see the homesickness, the sort of Weltschmerz, if he could have snapped his fingers and been back in Charlottesville or Washington, D.C., or even St. Louis, you sort of think that he would. And this is one of those great melancholy moments for Lewis when you realize that he's sort of spiritually empty, that the tank is very nearly empty, and yet he has 4,000 miles to go. And if you follow the return journey, he starts to lose some of his self-control during that period, and it leads to erratic decision-making, including, of course, going hunting with a blind man or nearly blind man on August 11th, 1806. And then this one, I'll just quickly read it. This is, they had nothing really to fear from the lower Columbia natives except pilfering, which there was quite a bit of, unlike, say, the Lakota back in North Dakota. But Lewis has sort of, you can see again that his loss of patience here, and I'll just quickly read it. In the evening at sunset, we desired the Indians to depart as our custom and closed our gates. We never suffer parties of such number to remain within the fort all night, for notwithstanding their apparent friendly dispositions, their great avarice and hope of plunder might induce them to be treacherous. At all events, we determined always to be on our guard as much as the nature of our situation will permit, and never place ourselves at the mercy of any savages. We well know that the treachery of the aborigines of America, the too great confidence of our countrymen in their sincerity and friendship, has caused the destruction of many hundreds of us. So long have our men been accustomed to a friendly intercourse with the natives, that we find it difficult to impress on their minds the necessity of always being on their guard with respect to them. This confidence on our part we know to be the effect of a series of uninterrupted friendly intercourse, but the well-known treachery of the natives by no means entitle them to such confidence, and we must check its growth in our minds as well as those of our men by recollecting ourselves and repeating to our men that our preservation depends on never losing sight of this trait in their character and being always prepared to meet it in whatever shape it may present itself. That's wise thinking of a military commander. I don't think anyone would doubt that, but it feels a little excessive, particularly in view of the situation at hand. And I think you can again see that Lewis is beginning to lose some of his equanimity here. He's impatient to get home. He's impatient with the natives. He's impatient with the men. Perseverance in a trip like this is everything. And Clark had it, and Lewis not quite so much. So there's a romp through 3 winters. I know it went pretty quickly. I didn't get to mention the Christmas gifts. I'll just close with that. So Clark gets a shirt, hose, and a vest from Lewis. He gets a basket from Goodrich. He gets 24 weasel's tails from Sacagawea and other gifts. No mention of any gift of any sort for Meriwether Lewis. Now, maybe he got gifts, but because he wasn't keeping a journal on Christmas, he didn't mention them. But you get this sense that everyone loved Clark and wanted to give him stuff. I would bet my life that Sacagawea didn't give Lewis 24 weasel's tails. Lewis was not that kind of a guy. Lewis was that kind of detached and aloof senior commander. And so when you see this list, and I'm sure we don't all have all the information. I'm sure Clark gave Lewis something. They also gave the men the last of the tobacco, and the men that didn't chew or smoke, but mostly chew, they gave handkerchiefs. So there must be more to the story. And it just reminds you of the last thing I'll say here is that we never, ever, ever wish Lewis had written less. We always wish Lewis had written more. Had he written during this period, it would be a richer story. Clark was amazing and reliable, and Ordway too. But it's Lewis's voice that we miss. And if Lewis's voice were there, and maybe we'll find lost or unpublished journals, but if Lewis's voice were there, this would be an even greater, richer, more fascinating story than it now is. And it already is one of the greatest stories that any of us can ever encounter in the course of our lives. So I'll stop there. And Aaron, if you want to broker some questions, I'd be delighted.
Well, thanks so much, Clay. That was wonderful. I don't know whether you probably were thinking about timing this talk for the week or so before the solstice or the equinox, and so that's a
Yes.
very appropriate. We do have some questions in the chat box, and Philippa, do you want to unmute and maybe take it from there, see what you have in mind, and then we'll look at the questions in the chat box.
So let's go to 5:20 if that's all right, Central
Okay.
Time. And those who need to leave, of course, do, and happy holidays.
Definitely, as much time as you have, you have an audience of the thankful and devoted. So
I got nothing to do until New Year's.
that might be true of many of us here. So we can celebrate together and celebrate the anticipation of the holidays, which are surely better this year than last year, notwithstanding the increase in COVID over Thanksgiving. But I think this format of spending Sunday afternoons together across the country will not leave us, regardless of the extent to which we are able to vanquish COVID, if we are to any extent. But so we're very thankful that you have and that you've put this together in this way. Their naivete is startling when, but not surprising, considering the language barrier that they divined as much as they did about Indian life is amazing. The naivete in saying, we don't want you to fight. We want you to trade with each other, without knowing that the gender roles common among the tribes assigned fighting and hunting to the men, and ownership of the household, the produce, the gardening, to the women. But the women were represented at Fort Mandan in that they did the trading because they owned the food. And that's significant in the importance of gender roles. We tend to blur those distinctions currently, but can you address the evidence of gender roles in the tribes they encountered and their recording of it?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I was just trying to turn on a little light there. Two things. First of all, I love what you said about the pandemic. When Lewis says we hope next year to participate fully in the mirth and hilarity of the occasion. I mean, isn't that what we're all aching for, is to get back to mirth and hilarity? And my daughter's coming back from England. She's leaving Tuesday morning. She has to get a COVID test. One of her friends tested positive for Omicron. She's not sure she'll even get out. When I came back from England a couple of weeks ago, I had to jump through many hoops just to get on an airplane. We're all exhausted. We're mentally exhausted. We're spiritually exhausted, and we want that mirth and hilarity. So we can kind of relate, as they say, to Meriwether Lewis at Fort Clatsop. As to these gender roles, first of all, the captains did a great job. If you look at Lewis's ethnography, especially during that January to March 23rd period in 1806, it's excellent. He's noticing costumes, clothing, ceremonial items, implements, how canoes are fashioned, the different types of canoes, the tools that are used to build canoes, bows and arrows, the nature of their firearms, etc. When he's on physical culture, things that you can see with your eyes and measure, he's outstanding. When he gets to metaphysical, gender roles, etc., less so. That's one thing. Secondly, Lewis and Clark were carrying a lot of baggage, a lot of white preconceptions about natives. And one of the principal preconceptions that they carried was that Indian women were, quote, drudges, that they did all the scut work and that the men just sat around smoking and going to war. And they even when they knew better, when they observed that wasn't quite true, they went back to that trope. They just couldn't help themselves. And that's what helps to explain that crazy thing Lewis said about if we let down our guard for even a second, they'll be jumping us. He's carrying this baggage, as we all do to a certain degree, all of us on every question of race and the other. But they were carrying some very serious frontier attitude and presuppositions that they did not allow the facts in front of them to. And here's a perfect example, Philippa. Lewis, in some sense, presides over the birth of Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau on February 11th, 1805. Clark is somewhere else, Charbonneau somewhere else. And he says, oh, she had a very difficult time. It was very rough, very, very difficult, much pain and agony, prolonged. And then a few months later, he says, yeah, the amazing thing about these Indian women is you're walking through the woods, they disappear for 20 minutes and they come back having given birth to a baby. It's shocking how easy that is for them. Well, which is true, Mr. Lewis. He's carrying these notions that he's probably been imbibing since birth. Jefferson had some of them too. And he can't allow the evidence in front of him so it's worse than naivete. It's complicity in racial profiling. I'm not trying to get into our current politics here, but there's that. And so twice in the expedition, young Native men said to Lewis through interpreters, if we did what you said and lived in peace, then how would we get chiefs? Because our leaders emerge as leaders in war and for their prowess as warriors. And if we did this, how would we get women? Because women admire those who have achieved something great in the hunt or something great in war, counted coup. And Lewis and Clark have no answer to that. Their view is, and by the way, I admire their view. Their view is we represent the Enlightenment, and we believe that commerce is superior to war, and that if you would engage in commerce, that everybody would be happier, and that war is an unnecessary function. And this he's writing straight out of Hume and straight out of Jefferson in this, but it shows no dynamic understanding of the realities of the Native American world. And so, of course, that's naive. It's also deeply presumptuous. You have to remember, though, whenever we're critical of them, that their primary mission was to get out there and get back, which they did, with only one of their members dead, and he from natural causes. And of course, Jefferson wanted them to take down latitude and longitude and collect plants and minerals and bring back specimens and take down Indian vocabularies and ethnography and so on. And they did a good job of all of that, longitude notwithstanding, and that they did not penetrate into the deeper recesses of the Native American world is hardly surprising given their function. They didn't have a dentist. They didn't have an artist. They didn't have a physician. This was strapping men who could stand a lot of pain. And so their mission was to get there and get back. And I think we need to be pretty charitable with respect to the failures of the nuances of their ethnography. But the most glaring of them are the ones you mentioned: gender, presuppositions about Indian women as drudges, and the belief that peace would solve all problems on the frontier.
Well, just as an accord, the thing about peace being, that's the great lie as well, because there'd been the American Revolution and the French wars in Canada, their war with Spain, Napoleon's at war. White men are making war all the time on themselves, and it's kind of a, almost like Candyland going into among these people and telling them they should be at peace when the history of Europeans, mankind, is rife with war.
Oh, come on, Mark. What are you saying, that Americans are hypocrites?
Did I say that? I just was pointing out observations. I didn't summarize that.
How dare you suggest that we could be hypocrites on questions of world domination?
Slap my hand, please.
But
I'm just sorry.
I think their attitude in Fort Mandan was very different from their attitude at Fort Clatsop. People stayed overnight at Fort Mandan, whereas there was evidence of purloining at Fort Clatsop, and they made the rule that nobody could stay overnight. So, and they were fairly far from the frontier by that time. Jefferson writes about in his boyhood, Indians came as emissaries, as representatives, as statesmen. By the time Jefferson was grown, he said you either had the church Indians who lived next door or the drunken Indians, and that had evolved as I think the regard for the Indians diminished with the distance from the frontier. But nonetheless, I think in Fort Mandan, they were open mouthed at their regard for how they could ride and hunt and grip with their knees, which was the same regard you cited as watching them go in and out of the waves.
Well, a couple things about that. First of all, the natives of the lower Columbia had a lot of contact with white traders, and they had become quite sophisticated, and they knew what they were doing, and they knew that they were essentially being cheated. You know, they'd get a fish hook for an otter skin and so on. So they'd raised prices, and Lewis and Clark would have supplemented their elk diet at Fort Clatsop with more wapato, more roots, including edible thistle, which doesn't sound great, but I'll bet John Fisher has had it. But they would have, but the prices were so high that they just couldn't afford it, and they were essentially bankrupt. And it is true too that if you read like these, I made this day-to-day list, anything that they weren't sitting on was going to get pilfered if natives could pilfer it. And they found a hatchet in the chief's robe, and they had to shame him. And then two of the good men were out sleeping somewhere on the way to the salt works or hunting, and natives took their rifles from under them. They were sleeping, leaning on their rifles, and the natives managed to take their rifles from them in the middle of the night without their knowing it. I mean, these are good pilferers. And if you read the journals of Captain Cook, it's the same thing, that it's not theft quite in the same way we regard theft. It's like a challenge. It's almost a game of a certain sort, but it's also theft. So when James Rhonda writes about this in Lewis and Clark Among the Indians, 1984, it's one of the few times when I disagree with him, because he's always taking the native side on this question and saying, oh, it's a game, or, that they need this metal, etc. But my view is that if any one of us were camping and people from the next camp in the middle of the night came over and took stuff from our campsite, we'd be justly angry. And even though different cultures have different ideas of personal property and so on, you certainly can understand the frustration of Lewis and Clark. And that's why I think they were more annoyed with the Chinook and the Clatsops than they were angry. But when they were in North Dakota, they were worried about the Lakota, and they had good reason to be worried about the Lakota. And they were surrounded there. If you read the journals from the lower Columbia, we're not quite sure where the Chinooks and the Clatsop are their villages are, where they're encamped. They kind of come in and out of the woods, and it's not even clear where they are. Where Lewis and Clark were, just above them, there were 4,500 people. So they knew that there was a potential security question there. And the Mandan, as we all know, had a well-deserved reputation for being extremely nice people and hospitable. There was some theft, but not very much during that period. And so I think the contrast between the virtuous Mandan and the honorable Nez Perce on the one hand, and the Walla Walla, and then the perfidious Chinook and Clatsop on the other, was one of the reasons that they overreacted. But I think that the pilfering is one of those situations where you can see the justice of both cultures, but when they come together, you certainly can see why Lewis and Clark hated that quality.
In addition to Dr. Rhonda's explanation, there's also the fact of other. We have our attitude toward the other, and they had their attitude. If it's other, a lot goes that you would not do to your own people.
Yes, of course. Agreed. I mean, these are classical cultural. I'll just give you one quick anecdote. I had a Lakota friend who's a famous international hoop dancer. I worked with him for a summer, and he would come into my motel room in Nebraska, and he'd go right to the little refrigerator, right to my basket of apples and just start eating. He would never say, do you mind if I do this? And one day I finally said to him, tell me what does this mean? That, because I would never come into your room and just start picking stuff up and eating. He said, well, you don't understand. In the Lakota world, you are required to offer free hospitality to anybody who wants it. They don't have to ask permission. It's assumed that what you have in abundance, they have a right to share. And he said, this is for us a really important part of the hospitality code. And if it isn't to you, I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. And so ever since then, I've tried to get my mind around this idea that you say, Philippa, that the other might be just wired in a completely different way, and that this leads to a lot of cultural misunderstanding and can lead to violence. I mean, think of what happened with the Whitmans in a silver cup out in the Pacific Northwest. But that doesn't make it any less mutually frustrating for both sides.
Clay, can we take a look at a few of the questions in the chat box?
Sure.
Just to summarize, we have a question regarding something that was said on a previous chat having to do with the comment that one of the Native American tribes said that the blacksmiths were the only men of the expedition they valued. And we proceeded on citations. Can you comment on that? Did they?
Yes, I reread my book to get ready for this because I haven't read it for a long time, and it's going to be reissued pretty soon. And so I read the chapter on this, and I think it's one of the strengths of my book that I really quote these two Canadians, Larocque and Mackenzie, and they're in Ray Woods and Thiessen's book about the upper Northwest fur trade. But I incorporate this because it's just a wonderful triangulation on Lewis and Clark. We learn an awful lot from these guys. So one of the things we learn is that LeBorn, the Hidatsa leader, who was very tough man, he's the one who tried to wipe the pigment off of York's face. He said there are only two sensible men among them, the blacksmith and the mender of guns. So that would be Shields and somebody else. Not Lewis, not Clark, not Droulier. The only two people that he admired, according to this report, were Shields and anyone else who was working in the blacksmith shop. And remember, during this time, this is kind of the Star Trek moment. They found that Native people would give them corn and squashes and sunflowers in exchange for pieces of metal. So they started cutting up old pieces of metal from an old burned out stove and selling 4-inch pieces for 6 gallons of corn and so on. And then they found out that the natives wanted them to fix implements like hoes and so on, which they did. And then they found out that the natives wanted them to fashion these ceremonial war axes. And so they did. And Lewis said, we can't even keep up with the demand. Blacksmiths are working day and night to keep up with this, but we need it for our nutrition. And then Lewis, in typical Lewis fashion, and this is in my book, finds fault with the Mandan battle axe design and says it's very inefficient. If they did it right, they would have a longer handle and it would weigh more. And I don't know why they can even settle for this very inefficient design, but if that's what they want, I suppose we do this. It's so Lewis. But yes, LeBorn thought that practical skills were the thing that mattered. And of course, if you're natives and you have muskets and you don't know how to repair them and you don't have any metal for spare parts, you're probably going to look on it that way. But he went farther, Aaron. It's really fascinating. LeBorn said, and what's the deal on beaver? You can't make a blanket out of beaver. It doesn't keep you warm in the winter. You don't eat beaver, really. He said they come from all over the world. They leave their families. They leave their communities. They're out here in the middle of nowhere, likely to get killed. And what are they hunting for? Not buffalo, not elk or moose. They're hunting for this little creature. He said, what is it about these white people that would make them obsess over this for fashion? So this is like a existential deconstruction of the entire fur trade. And of course, from LeBorn's point of view, that would be perfectly obvious. If you want a robe, you kill a buffalo. But if you kill a beaver, that's like going to be a glove or a slipper. And so he just couldn't understand. And he also said, all that huff and puff, they're always rattling on about sovereignty and the great chief and the great father and the stinking lake here and the sunset. He said, if we had them out on the plains, we could do with what we want with them. We could wipe them out. And so this is really valuable. There could be some distortion because the Canadians were not really friendly to Lewis and Clark, but these triangulated remarks give us a wholly more rich understanding. But it is Leborgne, the one-eyed, who is apparently the one who made that famous remark about the only two that he really could admire.
Another question in the chat box, which I've lost, is, taking into account Lewis's background, training, and temperament, if he had not been appointed governor, what would have been his post-expedition dream job? Dream job.
There's no answer to this question. I've given a bunch of my life to Meriwether Lewis. I'm sure it's obvious that I love Lewis and I admire him and I'm on his side and I prefer him, frankly, and because I find him so odd, intriguing, perplexing, and intricate, so complex, so problematic in so many wonderful ways, so rich as a writer. When the switch is on, man, Lewis can write magnificently, but he's so unresolved in some important ways. And so he said this had been a darling project of his for the last 10 years. So all of his adult life, he's not 30. All of his adult life, he's wanted this journey. And he had applied to Jefferson back in the Andre Michaud American Philosophical Society subscription plan, and Jefferson had thought that he was too young. So this is his dream. And when he gets to the source of the Missouri River, I feel strongly that he's a Missouri River man and not a Columbia, and that there's a palpable loss of interest in Lewis once he crosses into the Columbia Basin. Once he gets to the source of the Missouri, this is sort of like the greatest day of his life, certainly from June 13th, when he discovers the Great Falls, to the day that he bestrides the source of the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri. That, I think, is the greatest period of his life. Everything else is a bit of a falling off. So he comes back, he has reentry issues. Jefferson, I think, is grooming him for bigger things, so I know this is going to sound a little extreme, but Jefferson's going to make him the governor of Upper Louisiana, assuming that Lewis had done a superb job. He could be a senator from the new state of Missouri when it came, or governor. I think Jefferson might even have been grooming Lewis for the presidency. Monroe became president. Monroe did not have Lewis's gifts. Jefferson liked to groom these people. William Short was his favorite of his proteges. Short sort of moved in a Hamiltonian direction instead. But Jefferson was the kind of person who was grooming young men for greatness. And I think if Lewis had performed better, I acknowledge that it was a nearly impossible thing that he was doing in St. Louis. But if he had performed better and written his book, I don't think there's any practical end to what he might have achieved. And I think he flamed out, and it's just, of course, a horrible, sad tragedy. But if he hadn't been appointed, he probably would have finished the book. He didn't finish the book for lots of reasons. But the main one was that he was just so damn busy when he got to St. Louis that there was no time, and then time was running out, and he hadn't kept adequate journals and so on.
Do you think Jefferson had some culpability in not putting him in the basement of the White House and locking the door and
of course,
saying, I'll provide food until you finish?
Yeah, he could have assigned Captain Cook didn't write his own book. You go back and they give you a team of people, including ghostwriters and research assistants and illustrators and map makers. And it would have been very smart for Jefferson to put together a small team and keep Lewis close at hand and not distract him with the territory. But there was a small gene pool of people he could trust out there, and he knew that Lewis had been there and knew the territory and was brilliant. But I think that Jefferson's biggest mistake was thinking that everyone was a little Jefferson, that Lewis could just write the book on the side, as Jefferson would do. He wrote Notes on Virginia when he had been discredited as governor, had fallen from his horse and broken his wrist, and was living in an overseer's hut at his second plantation over near Lynchburg. So Jefferson had this notion that, you know, how hard is it to write a 3-volume account of your late journey? And he didn't realize that not everyone is Jefferson. And so he should have given Lewis the wherewithal. And if Lewis had had it, we would almost certainly have the book. And if we had the book, Lewis would be as important as Audubon. And our whole understanding of the Lewis and Clark story would be less adventure and more enlightenment, which is both good and bad. But just to quickly go back to the question, what would Lewis have done? Well, you always want a second shot. You know, if you've been to the moon, you want to go back. It's hard to imagine Lewis ever settling down and leading a quiet life. He's a romantic in a way that Clark is not. I think his happiest days are out there on the trail. And I think of that painting that Saint Mamim did of him in his buckskins and wearing the tippet that he got from Kimia Waite. You know, he didn't have himself painted in his officer's uniform. He didn't have himself painted as a Jeffersonian gentleman of Virginia. He had himself painted from that moment when he was with Kimia Waite making first contact with the Shoshone out in the middle of nowhere. And it was the quintessential explorer's moment when you are essentially naked and unarmed in the face of potential hostility, and your ingenuity and your bravery get you through. That's how he wanted to be remembered, at least in that painting. And that's a very odd choice. It's hard to think that Clark would ever have himself painted in a tippet. He would be painted in an officer's coat or a Kentucky gentleman's coat. Lewis is a strange man, I think, is the point that I wish to make. And so I don't know what he would have done, but I don't think that Lewis could re-enter. I think that Lewis essentially left his soul out there somewhere between the Great Falls and the source of the Missouri. And I think that his death in some ways is appropriate. That it's like, I don't want to see a 75-year-old Elvis either.
I think one other question in the chat box from Shannon Kelly: which winter would you say was the best for Lewis Clark or any of the others?
I think you want to be at Fort Mandan. Oh, the first winter doesn't really count because, you know, there are too many temptations. You're too close to Cahokia and St. Louis. You don't know each other yet. There's all this pecking order stuff. You know, males with testosterone are really going to have to sort all that out. And it's not a pretty picture if you've ever been in the oil fields or amongst longshoremen or anything like that. I don't think that winter was the best. And I don't think Fort Clatsop was the best. Lewis said that every time the natives would come, they'd bring fleas with them. And then the fleas would infest the entire fort for days, and they'd be smoking such clothes as they had. They were basically naked by now. They were making moccasins right and left just to have the chance of getting home with something like footwear. You know, only a few days did the sun shine, only a few days did it not rain. The elk was, if you killed it at dawn, it was spoiled by 5 p.m. The elk was so meager, it didn't have any fat content. There was no salt until later in the winter. The natives were not interesting. Everybody, without exception, found them to be sort of repulsive compared to the magnificent Nez Perce and the genial Mandan. I think everyone had enough, basically. And of course, the return journey is not the same as the outbound journey. The return journey is retracing steps along a well-known path, and you know you're going to suffer in the Bitterroots, and you know, blah, blah, blah. And so I think the Fort Mandan winter, because if you killed a buffalo on November 1st, it's still frozen on May 1st. And so there's no problem on preserving meat. And buffalo is rich in vitamin C, which handles scurvy. The Mandan could not have been more hospitable. And look, I mean, we don't want to dwell on it, but these men wanted sex, and not just sex. They wanted comfort. They wanted companionship. They wanted domesticity. They wanted something like family. And the Mandan provided this. The Mandan had this great adoption thing where they would adopt you for a period of time, and then you had sort of special status in that clan or in that lodge. And so the men weren't just wanting sex, although of course they were wanting that too. They wanted some break from all of the hard work and the hyper masculine ethos of the expedition. And so I can see some of them just enjoying the comfort of being with a family, being with women and not just other men. And so I think that was the winter that was the most pleasing to them in every way. And of course, once they realized you don't want to be outside very much, you're going to spend a lot of time indoors. That had to be a little bit hard, but I don't think it was as hard as being out in the wet, soggy, incessant rain and gloom and grayness of the Pacific coast in that year. That just sounds awful. A couple of years ago when we met at Astoria, I went out and spent 5 or 6 hours with the salt makers. And at the end of those 5 and 6 hours, you think, how'd you like to do this for 3 or 4 weeks? It's just, you just think, oh my goodness, this is just, it's like the whole thing is impregnated with moisture in every possible direction. And so if I were choosing, I would certainly choose the North Dakota winter, but each one had its own challenges. Just quickly to say before I forget, there were health concerns, and this goes really to David Peck and also to John Fisher. But so there weren't a lot of health concerns at Camp Wood. At Fort Mandan, there was frostbite, and several of the men were frostbitten, including York. And Lewis treated some natives for frostbite, and Clark had what he called rheumatism, and he had lots of problems in that way, and they all had some digestive problems. But at Fort Clatsop, it's William Bratton who was really the most seriously impaired, and Lewis thought he was going to die of lower back issues that were almost certainly a herniated or slipped disc, and was eventually cured by Nez Perce sweat lodges. But that was a very deep concern for Lewis. And then the STDs. I mean, he had to give that temperance lecture because he thought, I don't know how many men I can afford to have impaired for this long journey we have to make back home. So I can tell you as a lifelong North Dakotan that it's a healthy climate up here if you have the right gear.
Which is questionable about
Yeah, well,
whether they did.
They did not have the right gear. I mean, one way to talk about this, Philip, is that they crossed the country twice with inadequate footwear. If you think of the shoes that you can buy at an REI today, and then you think of what passed for shoes then, and it would be fun to have a shoe cam to determine when everybody's last pair of real shoes were gone, and they were now in moccasins, in and out of the river, on sharp rocks, prickly pear cactus. Unbelievable. So they crossed the country with shoes that no physician would allow you to wear today if you were walking across America.
But that's what's so astounding about the North Dakota winter. I mean, they say they only had watch for 20 minutes versus 4 hours because it was so cold. And yet they clearly did have the best time.
20 minutes is an eternity on a blizzard night in North Dakota. And I'm sure that there was even some loosening of that. Yeah, they had a great time, and I don't want to overplay the sex, but I do want to really emphasize the being part of a village, being part of a family. These Mandan were really sweet, and they invited them in, and they spent the night. When they went up on January 1st, Clark took half the men, 16 men, and they went up and danced for the Mandan, and the Mandan were mighty amused at the way that white people made music and danced, especially York. And Clark says that they were astonished that so large a man, that's why Charles Russell's painting is probably not very accurate, but that so large a man was as agile as York was. And York pretended that he was a semi-tamed bear, and there was a lot of hijinks going on during this period. But then as they come back at the end of the first day of January 1806, Clark says, half the men came back with me. Well, the other half of the men stayed overnight and enjoyed the company of families, and certainly I'm pretty sure enjoyed the company of women, sexually. This is a big deal. We don't like to talk about it, but humans have needs, and when you're on day 17 somewhere near Billings, Montana, and you're just with those other guys, and then there is the sort of the sacred woman Sacagawea that's off limits. That's a hard dynamic. And you see, for example, on our naval ships, now that women are on them, the pregnancy rates are are pretty high. People
Well,
don't like to be alone.
I think Clark was battling with himself vis-a-vis Sacagawea more than Lewis, and we know he liked them
What makes
young.
you say that, Philippa? You sound like you think it's Donna Reed and Charlton Heston and the Far Horizon. You think that he had a crush on Sacagawea.
I think there was a lot of approach avoidance. Maybe Marty at some point could comment on that he made himself stay away.
I want her to comment. David Peck, is she available for comment?
They may have gone
Actually,
to the next activity, but
she had a Zoom meeting she had to run up to like 2 minutes ago, so you lost out.
I'm so sorry, because I would love to hear her comment. I agree. Here's where I do agree with you, Philippa. I think there was a special relationship between Clark and Sacagawea in both directions. And I think that he protected her and made it clear to the rest of the men, she's off limits. And he then rebuked Charbonneau when he cuffed her on that at least one occasion. And then he wrote that unbelievable letter on August 20th, 1806 from the South Dakota border back to Charbonneau. And we wonder how that letter ever got back to Charbonneau. But he says, if you go read it, I'm not ready to say goodbye. I wish I could have rewarded your femme, your woman. There's no way to do that. But she was invaluable. And the child, my dancing boy Pomp, you can come to St. Louis. I'll raise him. I'll adopt him. I'll give you a business. I'll set you up on a farm. I mean, the whole thing it's an astonishing letter that Lewis could never have written. And so whatever else is true, Clark had a bond with her and her whole family. He liked Charbonneau, and Lewis could barely stand him. So there's something going on there, but whether he was thinking under the right circumstances, I don't know.
What about, how did Charbonneau read that letter since it was in English?
How did he get it?
Well, there's that too, but if he got it, how did he read it?
Who knows? But then, they did come down to St. Louis, and Clark did adopt the boy, and Clark did try to set them up in a business. And it was on their way back, apparently, that in 1812, that Sacagawea, they never got back to the Hidatsa villages. He wound up dying at Fort Manuel. I mean, I'm with you, Mark. It's just like a total mystery, but it's true. We know he wrote the letter, and he doesn't say he sent Coulter back with it, or he doesn't, or somebody else. Coulter's already long gone. It's pure mystery. And if you've ever seen the magnificent film, The Far Horizons, with Charlton Heston as Clark, and Donna Reed as Sacagawea, and Fred McMurray as Lewis, that they fell in love, and that she came to Washington, and that there was a ball that Jefferson threw for them, and that Julia Hancock was there too, because she was the presumed fiancée, and she sees Sacagawea looking adoringly at Clark, and Clark looking with some reverence at her, and then she confronts Sacagawea in the president's dressing room, and they're kind of dancing around each other, and then she says to him, "You love him too, don't you?" And then Jefferson realizes this mess, and he sends Sacagawea back in a government-sponsored coach taxi all the way to North Dakota with seeds to give to the Mandan so they can become more civilized. And so for me, that's the whole truth about the Clark-Sacagawea relationship.
Makes sense.
Makes sense, right? I don't know, Philippa. I think you can't rule out what you're saying. Of course, any Freudian is going to want to play with this. But I think Lewis was repulsed by many things, including, I think, sexuality. But he certainly wasn't going to write that letter, and he never bonded with her, and she certainly didn't bond with him. And whether there was any romantic edge to the relations between Clark and Sacagawea is a mystery, but I would err on the side of caution, I think. But we need Marty for this. We need bona fide psychological study. Let's do one more, Aaron.
Anybody else? Unmute yourself if you have a question that hasn't been asked.
I suppose for me, I sometimes, going back to that idea of whether it's sexual or anything like that, wanting to have a sense of home away from home. Sometimes for me, I wonder if for Lewis, if it's Fort Mandan or if it's in some way Camp Dubois, because he's not on the scene at Camp Dubois where men are punching themselves and getting drunk on Christmas. He's hanging out with the Shotos in St. Louis, allegedly at least having women fawning over him. What would you make of that?
I tried to understate it a little bit, Shannon, in my remarks, because Lewis was doing important things in Cahokia and in St. Louis, no question. But I also think he wanted to be in St. Louis and Cahokia. He liked the Shotos. He liked to dress up. He liked clothing. He liked good food. He liked what he says on that January 1st thing at Fort Clatsop, the repast that the hand of civilization could put in front of him. After all, he had lived with the President of the United States, America's single most elegant bachelor, for 2.5 years in the White House. And he must have gotten infected by Jefferson's elan and dignity and hospitality and gentlemanly manners. So Lewis is really not, he's both things. He lives in two worlds, whereas Clark is a frontiersman who lives out in Kentucky and on the falls of the Missouri. And he's not incapable of playing the gentleman, but it's not his natural style. He's more acculturated into the frontier world than Lewis ever was. And there's a certain prissiness, there's a certain emotional aloofness and detachment in Lewis. And I think that his view was, thank goodness there are important maps to study in St. Louis and people to consult, because I sure would not want to spend the winter out there at that crude compound. Now, the question of Lewis and women is a vexed one. He never married. He called himself a fusty, rusty, musty old bachelor after yet another woman turned him down or left town to avoid him, which tells you something. He said that I've never felt less like a hero than I currently do. I mean, there's something going on there that's hard to, again, we need Marty and a team of psychologists to look at this, but any old explorer hero can find someone to marry him. That Lewis couldn't suggests it's much more complicated than we can possibly know. I think he liked the idea of being a ladies' man, but I don't think that he had the vibe, or whatever is the case, he never managed to marry. And if one point I make in all my work and in my book is that if he had found someone, he almost certainly wouldn't have committed suicide. That when the dark night of the soul comes, and all of us have been there, you need your best friend, you need a spiritual advisor, you need a spouse, a child, a parent. His mother, Lucy, was still in Virginia. She was going to be coming, but she wasn't there yet. His brother, Reuben, was up on the Yellowstone. John Marks was back in Georgia or Virginia. He's not a Christian, so he doesn't have the capacity to turn to a priest or a minister. He's a Mason, but that's going to be short satisfaction in a moment like that. And the dog is gone. If I argue that if the dog were still with him, he probably would have lived through that night. And the psychologists suggest that that's the case, that if we have somebody else to love, that we don't dwell on ourselves quite so mercilessly. And if Clark had been there, there's no way that he would have killed himself, because Clark would have separated him from liquor, would have separated him from ammunition, would have held his hand through the night. And so Lewis really was alone in the profoundest sense of the term when he was at that frontier hut 70 some miles from Nashville. And the fact that he couldn't bond with a woman is mighty perplexing, but I think it also points to the spiritual collapse of Mr. Lewis. We just don't know. There's so many mysteries. And I'll just close with a couple of mysteries. One is, why are the forts of different designs? That really interests me. And why isn't Lewis writing during this period? Because if you follow my thesis, Lewis always had to be first. And so he is first to the Pacific coast. The rest of them are stuck at Dismal Niche. He goes on ahead and he arrives at the shore. He arrives at Station Camp and beyond and carves his name in a tree. This is a big, big deal. This is the end of the great journey. And he's silent. You would have expected that he would have at least written something. Several other members, White House included, write that we now have triumphed over this continent and reached the end of this great journey. Lewis not. And then he does pick up his pen when he's searching for the winter quarters. So we hear from him as he's trying to figure out what creek, what river, how far from the coast to set up Fort Clatsop, but he doesn't write about this. And in North Dakota, in this critically important negotiation with the Hidatsa, he goes alone. Clark is back at Fort Mandan. Lewis goes, the Hidatsa are going to be more important than the Mandan because the Hidatsa helped to control Montana. And Lewis goes off for these high-level meetings with LeBourne and others, and he doesn't write about it. You think, well, that's not, normally we get it, that Clark will write the day-to-day stuff, that it's captain's log. But when Lewis is doing something that Clark is not in a position to describe, and it's important, like negotiations with the Hidatsa or finding the actual end of the journey, you have to report. I mean, Nicandry says he would have been court-martialed in England. I doubt that, but you have to report those moments. And if you can't report them, you come back and tell Clark, and Clark will report them, but he doesn't. And so there's just something, why? I mean, we just can't get our heads around this. And we get it that he was tired, but all explorers are tired. I lead these groups every summer on the Lewis and Clark Trail. It's glamping. Somebody is providing us wine and hors d'oeuvres, and they set up our tents. And I try to write a journal at the end of the day, and I think, oh, the hell with it. I'll just go to sleep, because you're tired. And so it takes serious discipline to do this kind of thing. And Lewis had discipline when he wanted it, but he doesn't on some really important occasions. And he let down the president, and Jefferson knew it and was mad. And he let down the country. And more than that, he let down himself, because as I've said twice in this talk, if he had done it, he would be regarded at a much higher echelon in the history of the world's explorations than he is. Leaving it to Nicholas Biddle to write a paraphrased narrative of the adventure side of the story, cheated us and cheated himself, his rightful place in the history of exploration. And so that just breaks my heart. But as we like to say, it is what it is. So Aaron, you can see I'll talk till 9. We should probably close here.
We still have we have 38 people on, and so keep talking if you want to.
I will, as long as I just don't want to, I don't want to belabor anything or become that guy.
I think you can give us some more topics for 2022, please, so we can continue to meet. I think everybody is very happy. And I think we appreciate your fresh look, because it enables us to look at the material we're accustomed to seeing with fresh eyes. That's probably the biggest spoon, and that's one of your goals, and to get younger people to join on.
Well, thank you, Philippa. So first of all, I love what I get to do. Editing WPO is an honor and a privilege, and I just urge all of you to consider writing for it. Write letters to the editor, write articles, suggest to others that they write articles. It's really important that we bring fresh voices. I like the voices we have, of course, but we need fresh voices. And several scholars during the bicentennial basically said, well, we know what there is to know about this thing. That is so far from true. We need so many books. And so I'm wanting WSU in Pullman to commission Lewis and Clark among the Lakota, and then Lewis and Clark among the Shoshone, and Lewis and Clark among the Clatsop and Chinook, and Lewis and Clark among the Crow, and Lewis and Clark, etc. So that we need this particular studies, the way we have it with Pinkham and Evans, Lewis and Clark among the Nez Perce. Some of them will be lumped together because they weren't with them that long, but you certainly need a Shoshone, a Lakota book, and a Mandan Hidatsa book. And so we desperately need those books. And we need to work with the Native American community to encourage them. And I would hope that the foundation could find money, or someone would donate money to provide stipends and fellowships to Native Americans who would either pair up with an academic scholar or do it themselves with, we could have training sessions, but I think we should try to seed that, to nurture that. And then just like this book, Lewis and Clark in Winter, would be a great book, because we're looking at the same story, of course, but we're looking at it through a certain lens. And so looking at it through the winters has not been done, and it would be an outstanding book. I'd love to try it. but also the return journey. Nicandri's view is that the return journey from January 1st, 1806 until September 23rd. And I've written a little bit about this. When they left Fort Mandan, they meet more than 100 people going up. And those encounters are extraordinarily important. You know, we need a book on the 9 young men from Kentucky. That would be a really, actually should be 10. York is the 10th. We need that book. And so there are so many books that we still need. Gender, there are several books that talk about gender, including Miss Barbie's book on Sacagawea, a Euro-American phenomenon, which is a really fine book. But some of these new books, these new treatments of gender, get a little into the postmodernist weeds. And I think we need more basic work than that, just like use a gender lens to look at the entire expedition, whether it's Jefferson and his daughters or Lewis and his mother, or Sex on the Trail, or, you know, the marriage of Clark and Julia, Native American women and their roles, different roles for different women in different societies. Amy Mossett was doing some really good work on that during the bicentennial. We need that book. You know, I want John Fisher to write up his extraordinary work in the medical kit of Lewis and Clark. The kit is as important as anything else, and nobody knows more about that than John. And so we have so many things. I'd love, if you want me back, I'd love to talk about homecoming, the leaving Fort Mandan all the way to their successful reentry into St. Louis on September 23rd. But I just want all of you to think of topics, because A, we can put them in We Proceeded On, and B, every time this illuminates some aspect of the journey that I'm sure today, that even though most of you know as much or more about this than I do, I'm sure some things you thought, wow, I hadn't thought that way, or I hadn't really seen that. I think that's what is so valuable. We're looking at the same material with fresh eyes, and as we do, fresh things will pop. And so I'm looking forward to reading So Hard to Die, because it's a book length attempt to make sense of the last days of Meriwether Lewis and his mental state, and that mystery, as you know, continues. So just everyone, I think, pony up. Nothing can go wrong. You know, if you decide in the end you don't want to write that book, you can pass it off to somebody else. But we should be brainstorming, because we all know that we're a little bit stuck. We have Gary's superb 13 volumes. Then he's written this extraordinary new book, which I so highly recommend, the Lewis Clark Expedition Day by Day. I would never say that Gary is done, but Gary has done enough, certainly if he wanted it to be done. We now have the text sitting there. It's just waiting for fresh eyes for the Montana section, fresh eyes for Idaho, fresh eyes for the coast. And I think everyone who gives it some real energy finds things that they didn't know or had forgotten about, and that deserve a more prominent place in our understanding. And so for me, I would love to be the midwife to some of this, and I get to be through We Proceeded On. I'm very proud of this Stephen Ambrose commemorative issue. And I want to expand the reach of WPO younger authors a little bit beyond the river into other explorations, more book reviews, more letters to the editor. I think, you know, we face, and I don't want to get gloomy here as we close, Philippa, but we do face an existential crisis that most of us are in the last third of our lives. That's putting it nicely, I suppose, but most of us are in the last third of our lives, and we're not recruiting very well at the other end. This story is so fundamentally fascinating and rich that it deserves to be a story of growth in the American memory rather than decline. And we bear a responsibility to make that happen. It won't happen without us. I don't know what we can do, but we have to work at it. And if we don't, we're going to be like the Masonic Lodge and the Moose. And that would be a really serious failure of American memory. And so the trail, of course, but we need new historiography, and we need historiography that will bring young people into the mix.
Well, now we have our charge for the new year. Please include recommending books for review and recommending people whom you think would be good reviewers. So you can write to me, you can write to Clay at editor@lewisandclark.org, even if you don't know a reviewer. But if you come across a book, or even better, book reviews are usually in the last 2 years having been published. But if you can put together 3 books on a theme that is suggested by Lewis and Clark and write 3 paragraphs on each book, that would be a great feature. 5 books would be better. Friendship in Lewis and Clark, sexuality in Lewis. So whatever, because not everyone has read everything. And it may well be that highlighting previous books or books associated with the West, associated with that period of history, would be an absolutely great feature.
I
So-
agree. And we could review Old Chestnuts. There are 3 known books on medical aspects of the expedition, one written by someone in this room. But we need to go back to some of those. Lewis and Clark, Pioneering Naturalists, is a marvelous book. It deserves to be remembered. And Passage Through the Garden, John Logan Allen's masterpiece. These books, most of us in this room have looked at them at some point, but not recently. And they repay rereadings, and they would repay reprintings with new introductions and forwards. And because all of them, if they were written before the year 1990, have some issues about nomenclature with Native Americans, about a Eurocentric view, a view that doesn't include enough gender relations. They all were great works, but they suffer from the lens that was the common lens of those times. And so we should do our best to remind our members of the greatness of those books, but also to say those ways in which they would now be written differently if they were being written in the mid 21st century. So I agree with you 100%, Philip. It doesn't just have to be books published now, but we need new books published now. And I can promise you, if you have one, I'll help you get it published in WSU Press, because they're hungry.
And they're a good press. When I wrote a book for University of Idaho that didn't get published, part of the cutting line was I wanted to publish with WSU because University of Idaho no longer has a press, and U of I's Alumni Association said, we're not going to publish a book that's with another university. So
Wow.
they're a good one.
Thank you.
Well,
I guess I'm presenting for, Sarah has me set up. I'll be presenting in February on Frederick Bates. We decided it would have been insensitive to have that be in October around Lewis's death date. We felt like maybe some bad optics to that. Kind of, it's interesting because on the idea of revisiting older books and their influences on what we have now, I'm wanting to revisit Meriwether Lewis's first biography by Charles Mara Wilson. I have a copy. It's horrible, but so surprisingly, despite it was known to be horrible at the time of publication, so many pieces of Wilson's vision have permeated down to the present, where even when I have visitors on my fort tours at Fort Mandan, people spit stuff out to me that they don't know it, but it never, claims about Lewis don't exist at any point until Wilson publishes that book in the 30s. So that's,
well, I
don't
think
know.
that's the
it's a
case.
weird book, but he calls the dog Brewster and you don't know where that comes from.
Brewster.
So
But
it's a case in point about what we're saying, worth revisiting both for its strengths and also for what differs from more information that we have. But I think, Clay, you've been more than generous with your
look who it
time.
I just want to say, I can't wait to hear Shannon's attempt to make sense of
Philip's
Frederick
wife.
Bates.
What's
I've decided I don't like him, but I understand him more. I also figured out I'm a first cousin to him, 9 times removed through both of his parents, which it's not close enough for me to thank Clark for not letting Lewis kill him in a duel, but it's enough that when I show, it's on my mom's side, and when I told that to my dad, he's like, Well, that explains your mom's entire family.
That's
so-
what I was about to say, Shannon, but you know, Bates has a point of view, even if we don't like him.
What's your date? Do you have one?
I have to look at my email. She's going to post it soon to the calendar. It's
Okay.
either February 13th or 20th. It's one of those Sundays in February.
Great. Well, thank all of you, especially Clay, for spending this rainy, perhaps sunny, perhaps snowy afternoon with all of us, and we'll look forward to 2022. It's usually such a little letdown after the busyness of the holidays, but we know we can have something to look forward to. So please give me dates and topics, and we'll hope to arrange. But
Thanks
thank
to all of you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Aaron.
Thanks,
And
Clay.
this has been great fun. And if I've made mistakes, I want you to correct them, because I don't, you know, we only know what we think we know.
Well, modesty
Thanks,
is a
Clay.
very becoming trait. You have it. Thank you. And thank you, Aaron, for hosting all of us.
Yes.
And we'll look forward to seeing everybody, we hope, in 2022. Have great holidays with the ones you love, either virtually or in person, and enjoy and stay well.
Clay, are
Thank
you,
you, everybody.
Clay still there?
Thank you.